The Commodore 64, also known as the C64, C64, C equals 64, or occasionally CBM64 or VIC64, is an 8-bit home computer introduced in January 1982 by Commodore International. It is listed in the Guinness World Records as the highest-selling single computer model of all time, with independent estimates placing the number sold between 10 and 17 million units. Volume production started in early 1982, with machines being released onto the market in August at a price of $595. Preceded by the Commodore VIC-20 and Commodore PET, the C64 takes its name from its 64 kilobytes of RAM, and has technologically superior sound and graphical specifications when compared to some earlier systems such as the Apple II and Atari 800. With multicolor sprites and a more advanced sound processor, the C64 dominated the low-end computer market for most of the 1980s. For a substantial period, the C64 had between 30% and 40% share of the US market and 2 million units sold per year, outselling the IBM PC compatibles, Apple Inc. computers, and the Atari 8-bit family of computers. Sam Tramiel, a later Atari president and the son of Commodore's founder, said in a 1989 interview, "When I was at Commodore we were building 400,000 C64s a month for a couple of years, in the UK market." The 64 faced competition from the BBC Micro and the ZX Spectrum, but the 64 was still one of the two most popular computers in the UK. Part of the Commodore 64's success is because it was sold in retail stores instead of just electronics or computer stores. Commodore produced many of its parts in-house to control costs, including custom IC chips from Evan-Amos technology. It has been compared to the Ford Model T automobile for its role in bringing a new technology to middle-class households via creative mass production. Approximately 10,000 commercial software titles have been made for the Commodore 64, including development tools, office productivity applications, and games. C64 emulators allow anyone with a modern computer, or a compatible video game console, to run these programs today. The C64 is also credited with popularizing the computer demoscene and is still used today by some computer hobbyists. In 2008, 17 years after it was taken off the market, research showed that brand recognition for the model was still at 87%. History. In January 1981, Evan-Amos Technology, Inc., Commodore's integrated circuit design subsidiary, initiated a project to design the graphic and audio chips for a next-generation video game console. Design work for the chips, named Evan-Amos Technology VIC-2 and Evan-Amos Technology SID, was completed in November 1981. Commodore then began a game console project that would use the new chips, called the Ultimax or alternatively the Commodore Max machine, engineered by Yash Terakura from Commodore Japan. This project was eventually cancelled after just a few machines were manufactured for the Japanese market. At the same time, Robert Bob Russell and Robert Bob Evan-Amos were critical of the current product lineup at Commodore, which was a continuation of the Commodore PET line aimed at business users. With the support of Al Charpentier and Charles Winterbull, they proposed to Commodore CEO Jack Tramiel a true low-cost sequel to the VIC-20. Tramiel dictated that the machine should have 64 kilobytes of random access memory. Although 64 KB dynamic random access memory chips cost over $100 at the time, he knew that DRAM prices were falling, and would drop to an acceptable level before full production was reached. In November, Tramiel set a deadline for the first weekend of January, to coincide with the 1982 Consumer Electronics Show. The product was code-named the VIC-40 as the successor to the popular VIC-20. The team that constructed it consisted of Yash Terakura, Bob Russell, Bob Evan-Amos and David A. Ziembitsky. The design, prototypes and some sample software were finished in time for the show. After the team had worked tirelessly over both Thanksgiving and Christmas weekends, the machine incorporated Commodore BASIC 2.0 in ROM. BASIC also served as the user interface shell and was available immediately on startup at the ready prompt. When the product was to be presented, the VIC-40 product was renamed C64. The C64 made an impressive debut at the January 1982 Consumer Electronics Show, as recalled by production engineer David A. Ziembitsky. All we saw at our booth were Atari people with their mouths dropping open, saying, "How can you do that for $595? The answer was vertical integration, due to Commodore's ownership of MOS Technologies' semiconductor fabrication facilities. Each C64 had an estimated production cost of $135. Market war upon its introduction in August 1982, the C64 faced a wide range of competing home computers. With a lower price and more flexible hardware, it quickly outsold many of its competitors. In the United States, the greatest competitors were the Atari 8-bit 400, the Atari 800, and the Apple II. The Atari 400 and 800 had been designed to accommodate previously stringent FCC emissions requirements and so were expensive to manufacture. The latest revision in the aging Apple II line, the Apple I, had higher resolution graphics modes than the C64. Though similar in specifications, the two computers represented differing design philosophies. As an open architecture system, upgrade capability for the Apple II was granted by internal expansion slots, whereas the C64's comparatively closed architecture had only a single external ROM cartridge port for bus expansion. However, the Apple used its expansion slots for interfacing to common peripherals like disk drives, printers and modems. The C64 had a variety of ports integrated into its motherboard which were used for these purposes, usually leaving the cartridge port free. Commodore's was not a completely closed system. However, the company had published detailed specifications for most of their models since the PET and VIC-20 days, and the C64 was no exception. All four machines had similar memory configurations which were standard in 1982, 1983. 48K for the Apple II Plus and 48K for the Atari 800. At upwards of $1,200, the Apple II was about twice as expensive, while the Atari 800 cost $899. One key to the C64's success was Commodore's aggressive marketing tactics, and they were quick to exploit the relative price-performance divisions between its competitors with a series of television commercials after the C64's launch in late 1982. The company also published detailed documentation to help developers, while Atari initially kept technical information secret. At a mid-1984 conference of game developers and experts at Origins Game Fair, Dan Bunton, Sid Meier, and a representative of Avalon Hill all stated that they were developing games for the 64 first as the most promising market. In April 1986, Computer Gaming World published a survey of 10 game publishers which found that they planned to release 43 Commodore 64 games that year, compared to 19 for Atari and 48 for Apple II. And that year Alan Miller stated that Accolade developed first for the C64 because it will sell the most on that system. Commodore sold the C64 not only through its network of authorized dealers, but also through department stores, discount stores, toy stores and college bookstores. The C64 had a built-in RF modulator and thus could be plugged into any television set. This allowed it to compete directly against video game consoles such as the Atari 2600. Like the Apple II, the C64 can also output a composite video signal that can be plugged into a specialized monitor for a sharper picture. Unlike the E, the C64's NTSC output capability also includes separate luminance, chroma signal output equivalent to S-video, for connection to the Commodore 1702 monitor, providing even better video quality than a composite signal. Aggressive pricing of the C64 is considered to have been a major catalyst in the North American video game crash of 1983. In January 1983, Commodore offered a $100 rebate in the United States on the purchase of a C64 to anyone trading in another video game console or computer. To take advantage of this rebate, some mail-order dealers and retailers offered a Timex Sinclair 1000 for as little as $10 with purchase of a C64, so the consumer could send the TS-1000 to Commodore, collect the rebate, and pocket the difference. Timex Corporation departed the computer market within a year. Commodore's tactics soon led to a price war with the major home computer manufacturers. The success of the VIC-20 and C64 contributed significantly to the exit of Texas Instruments and other smaller competitors from the field. The price war with Texas Instruments was seen as a personal battle for Commodore President Jack Tramiel. In June 1983, Commodore lowered the C64's list price to $300, and some stores sold the computer for $199. At one point, the company was selling as many C64s as all computers sold by the rest of the industry combined, while T lost money by selling the 99 quarters A for $99. T's subsequent demise in the home computer industry in October 1983 was seen as revenge for T's tactics in the electronic calculator market in the mid-1970s. When Commodore was almost bankrupted by T, Computer Gaming World stated in January 1985 that companies such as EPYX that survived the video game crash did so because they jumped on the Commodore bandwagon early. In Europe, the primary competitors to the C64 were British-built computers, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, the BBC Micro and the Amstrad CPC 464. In the UK, the 48K Spectrum had not only been released a few months ahead of the C64's early 1983 debut, but it was also selling for £175, less than half the C64's £399 price. The Spectrum quickly became the market leader and Commodore had an uphill struggle against it. The C64 did however go on to rival the Spectrum in popularity in the latter half of the 1980s. Adjusted to the size of population, the popularity of Commodore 64 was the highest in Finland, where it was subsequently marketed as the Computer of the Republic. Although rumors spread in late 1983 that Commodore would discontinue the C64, Commodore sold about 1 million C64s in 1985 and a total of 3.5 million by mid-1986. Although the company reportedly attempted to discontinue the C64 more than once in favor of more expensive computers such as the Commodore 128, demand remained strong. In 1986, Commodore introduced the 64C, a redesigned 64, which Compute saw as evidence that, contrary to C64 owners' fears that the company would abandon them in favor of the Amiga and 128, the 64 refuses to die. Its introduction also meant that Commodore raised the price of the C64 for the first time, which the magazine cited as the end of the home computer price war. Software sales also remained strong. Microprose, for example, in 1987 cited the Commodore and IBM PC markets as its top priorities. By 1988, Commodore was still selling between 1 and 1.5 million C64s worldwide every year, although EPYX CEO David Shannon Morse cautioned that there are no new 64 buyers, or very few. It's a consistent group that's not growing. It's going to shrink as part of our business. One computer gaming executive stated that the Nintendo Entertainment System's enormous popularity, 7 million sold that year, almost as many as the number of C64s sold in its first 5 years, had stopped the C64's growth. And Trip Hawkins stated that Nintendo was the last hurrah of the 8-bit world. Although in the United States demand for the C64 had dropped off by 1990, it continued to be popular in the UK and other European countries. In the end, it was not lack of demand or the cost of the C64 itself, but the cost of producing the drive that ended the machine's long run. In March 1994, at CeBIT in Hanover, Germany, Commodore announced that the C64 would be finally discontinued in 1995, noting that the Commodore 1541 cost more than the C64 itself. However, only 1 month later, in April 1994, the company filed for bankruptcy. The C64 family. In 1982, Commodore released the Commodore Max machine in Japan. It was called the Ultimax in the United States, and VC-10 in Germany. The Max was intended to be a game console with limited computing capability, and was based on a very cut-down version of the hardware family later used in the C64. The Max was discontinued months after its introduction because of poor sales in Japan. 1983 saw Commodore attempt to compete with the Apple II's hold on the U.S. education market with the Educator 64, essentially a C64 and grayscale, monochrome monitor in a PET case. Schools preferred the all-in-one metal construction of the PET over the standard C64's separate components, which could be easily damaged, vandalized or stolen. Schools did not prefer the Educator 64 to the wide range of software and hardware options the Apple II was able to offer, and it was produced in limited quantities. Also in 1983, Commodore released the SX64, a portable version of the C64. The SX64 has the distinction of being the first full-color portable computer, while earlier computers using this form factor only incorporate monochrome displays. The base SX64 unit features a 5-in-color cathode ray tube and an integrated 1541 floppy disk drive. Unlike most other C64s, the SX64 does not have a cassette connector. In 1984, Commodore released the Commodore Plus 4. It has a higher color display, a newer implementation of Commodore Basic, and built-in software in what was positioned as an inexpensive business-oriented system. However, it is incompatible with the C64, and the burgeoning influence of the IBM PC on the personal computer market rendered the limited business software of the Plus 4 system of marginal value. The Plus 4 lacks hardware sprite capability and lacks a SID chip, thus underperforming in two of the areas that had made the C64 successful. Two designers at Commodore, Fred Bowen and Bill Hurd, were determined to rectify the problems of the Plus 4. They intended that the eventual successors to the C64, the Commodore 128 and 128D computers, were to build upon the C64, avoiding the Plus 4's flaws. The successors had many improvements such as a structured BASIC with graphics and sound commands, 80-column displayability, and full CP/M compatibility. The decision to make the Commodore 128 plug compatible with the C64 was made quietly by Bowen and Hurd, software and hardware designers respectively, without the knowledge or approval by the management in the post-Jack Tramiel era. The designers were careful not to reveal their decision until the project was too far along to be challenged or changed and still make the impending Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. Upon learning that the C128 was designed to be compatible with the C64, in a case of malicious compliance, the 128 design was altered to include a separate 64 mode, using a complete C64 environment to ensure total compatibility. In 1986, Commodore released the 64C computer, which is functionally identical to the original. The exterior design was remodeled in the sleeker style of the Commodore 128. The 64C's modifications are more than skin-deep, with new versions of the SID, VIC and I/O chips being deployed, with the core voltage reduced from 12V to 9V. In the United States, the 64CE was often bundled with the third-party GEOS graphical user interface-based operating system, as well as the software needed to access QuantumLink. The Commodore 1541 disk drive received a matching facelift, resulting in the 1541C. Later, a smaller, sleeker 1541E model was introduced along with the 800 KB 3.5-INCH micro floppy 1581. In 1990, the C64 was repackaged in the form of a game console, called the C64 Games System, with most external connectivity removed. A simple modification to the 64C's motherboard was made to allow cartridges to be inserted from above. A modified ROM replaced the basic interpreter with a boot screen to inform the user to insert a cartridge. Designed to compete with the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Master System, it suffered from very low sales compared to its rivals. It was another commercial failure for Commodore, and it was never released outside Europe. In 1990, an advanced successor to the C64, the Commodore 65, was prototyped, but the project was cancelled by Commodore's chairman Irving Gould in 1991. The C65's specifications are very good for an 8-bit computer, bringing specs comparable to the 16-bit Apple IIGs. For example, it can display 256 colors on screen, while OCS-based Amigas can only display 64 in half-bright mode. Although no specific reason was given for the C65's cancellation, it would have competed in the marketplace with Commodore's lower-end Amigas and the Commodore CD-TV C64 clone in the middle of 2004, after an absence from the marketplace of more than 10 years. PC manufacturer Tulip Computers BV announced the C64 Direct-to-TV, a joystick-based TV game based on the C64 with 30 games built into ROM. Designed by Jerry Ellsworth, a self-taught computer designer who had earlier designed the modern C1 C64 implementation. The C64D-TV was similar in concept to other mini-consoles based on the Atari 2600 and Intellivision, which had gained modest success earlier in the decade. The product was advertised on QVC in the United States for the 2004 holiday season. By packing the circuit board, it is possible to attach C1541 floppy disk drives, hard drives, second joysticks, and PS2 keyboards to these units, which gives the DTV devices nearly all of the capabilities of a full Commodore 64. The DTV hardware is also used in the mini-console Hummer, sold at Radio Shack in mid-2005. Newer compatible hardware C64 enthusiasts still develop new hardware, including Ethernet cards, specially adapted hard disks and flash card interfaces. Brand reuse. In 1998, the C64 brand was reused for the Web.IT Internet Computer, a low-powered Internet-oriented, all-in-one x86 PC running Windows 3.1. Despite its Commodore 64 nameplate, the C64 Web.IT is not directly compatible with the original, nor does it share its appearance. PC clones branded as C64X sold by Commodore USA, LLC, a company licensing the Commodore trademark, began shipping in June 2011. The The C64X has a case resembling the original C64 computer, but as with the Web.IT, it is based on x86 architecture and is not compatible with the Commodore 64 on either hardware or software levels. Virtual Console. Several Commodore 64 games were released on the Nintendo Wii's Virtual Console service in Europe and North America only. The games were removed from the service as of August 2013 for unknown reasons.